The second thing, and we tend to do this in science, is to ask questions like, how does it work? In science, it's one thing to make an observation, but I'm sorry about this. It's one thing to make an observation about some relationship, but if we can figure out how it works, we gain confidence in what we're seeing. And so we studied two questions, as I said. First, does it work? Secondly, how does it work? So I'm just going to show you just a couple slides here. This represents, as I say, 19 years worth of formal funding from the National Institutes of Health and even more years with funding elsewhere. And so you can't see it here so well, but, okay, you can see that red dot, can you all? In the back, okay? In any case, along this axis here, this is the number of precancer lesions in these animals. And what we're doing here is along this axis here, this is sort of looking at the effect of protein on the early development of these lesions. It's over the first 12 weeks, actually, from here to here. So we're looking at the formation of early cancers in these animals as a function of them consuming protein, either 20% or 5%. So if we give them 20% protein, for example, like the Indian workers did, you see that dotted line? These lesions come more and more and more over the 12-week period. They grow and kind of develop, and they're often running to become, let's say, tumors. In contrast, if we go back and do this study again, the first 3 weeks, we give them 20% to come up to there, and then if we have another group, they're at 20%, we give them 5%, we turn it off. And then we turn around and give them 20%, turn it back on again. And I could show this in many ways. It turned out we could turn on and turn off cancer development in these animals just by adjusting the protein intake. And it was entirely consistent with what the Indian workers had done. That is, the 20% protein actually caused cancers to grow, and the 5% animals did not, and we could switch it around and do this. But one issue here was the fact this is early cancer lesions. And of course, one would want to know, well, that's okay. What about waiting to see all the tumors fully grown? So the next slide here is that. Animals are fed for their lifetime, which is 2 years, about 100 weeks. And so fed either 5% or 20%. And the animals fed 20% for the full 2 years. There's the kind of tumor activity. 33:21 in case you can't see it. 5%, 248. That's a huge difference. That's almost like a 100-0 score. And we didn't need a statistician to tell us whether that was significant or not. So this was essentially really confirming once and for all we were seeing the same thing as the Indian workers had. The 20% good protein levels turned on cancer, the 5% did not. But here, this is what was interesting. The 5%, the ones given 5% protein considered not enough, should have been suffering, ill health, maybe not living. Those animals at the end of 2 years were alive and thrifty, no tumors. They had sleek hair coats. They were active around the cage, jumping around the cage. They were actually consuming more calories, a little more, and surviving and getting no tumors, having less protein. And we studied the question concerning, what does calories have to do with cancer and things like that in some detail. And so then the animals fed the 20%, they're all dead at 2 years. So I think we essentially confirmed in spades the idea that protein fed at 20%, the usual levels is generally recommended, at least under these conditions, it grew cancers, the lower level protein. Of all this nutrients, my gosh, this really sacred nutrient we all worry about, we get enough protein kind of thing. I'll come back to that point later. And here this protein was having a dramatic effect on tumor development. Now, admittedly, this is rats. This is liver cancer. It's maybe one could argue a very narrowly focused study, which it was. Of course, it was an opportunity to learn, how it all works, and I'll come back to it later. Now, one word of caution in some ways. I said 20% and 5%. We did a so-called dose-response relationship. We fed 4% and 6%, 8%, 10%, 12%, 14, 16, on up the line. It turns out protein is important. Protein is an essential nutrient. We need a certain amount of protein. And in the case of these rats, for example, they need about the same amount of protein as we do. And up to 10%, which is the amount needed for growth, no tumors really were growing. But once that level was satisfied, once they're getting enough protein to satisfy their needs, and they went in excess, this is when the tumor started to grow. So in other words, consume things at levels what we need. Don't be consuming in excess if you want to take that story, to the next degree. So we, as I said, were concerned about comparing 20% up here versus 5% down here, and obviously seeing these giant differences. But that's the more definitive relationship, if you will. Now, here was the part where it started getting really provocative. It turns out, when we tested soy protein and wheat protein at the 20% level, which turns on cancer development, we tested soy and wheat, it didn't have that effect. This was unique for the protein we were using. And the protein we were using was, of all things, casein. Now, I think that you know what casein is. It represents 87% of the cow's milk protein. That's a mistake. Well, 87% of the protein of cow's milk. One of the most sacred of all kinds of nutrient situations we can possibly imagine. It certainly is the kind of nutrient, if you will, that I, from my background, personally and professionally, thought was the very best. And so the casein of the animals is what was, in fact, turning on the tumor development. The soy and wheat did not. And so all of a sudden it was emerging here, at least looking at this level, here's a casein, an animal protein, and these two plant proteins going like that. The animal protein was turned on cancer development, the plant protein was not. And so a fairly significant effect. Now, I told you I had a second question to ask in this whole line of research. One was to see if it really worked like the Indian said it did. The other was to ask this question, how does it work?